garden variety writer. I enjoyed the talk. Thank you. I must say I'm a bit discouraged to hear that you've forgotten so many of your languages. I've studied a few, and I hope to retain them more than you have. But I was hoping for advice on 2 points. One, what someone who grew up, someone who grew up in Japan with the Japanese language, what that person should study in the way of language to become more literate, more expressive. Well, I'm referring here to things like classical Chinese, Manyo, for example, Kyu Kanazukai, these kinds of things. I don't think that, I think many people would like to duplicate some of the things that you've done, but I don't think it's possible, frankly. So what an ordinary person growing up in Japan might hope to, should do, just to become more expressive. And the other point would be, since you come from an Anglophone background, what someone in the Anglophone sphere also should do. For example, in the old days, even to a certain extent now, Latin, classical Greek, maybe French. What one should do in a limited way to increase literacy, to increase erudition, to increase one's ability to be expressive. Thank you.
There's no one way to become fluent in a foreign language. The first important thing is obvious, you must want to do it. There are many people who feel it's not necessary, say, to learn Japanese because there are so many Japanese who can understand English, why bother? This was true in the old generation of people who came here at the end of the 19th century and so on. They lived in a world of their own. They didn't have to associate with Japanese except shopkeepers and people like that. But if you really want to learn the language and you spend the time reading it, choose people to talk with, there must be a certain amount of cooperation on the part of the people you deal with. They mustn't want to practice your English. They must be willing to speak their own language to you. I still have this problem to some degree. People think I can't read Japanese. I've had, not once, but a number of times, I'm introduced before a lecture, and someone who presents me says, he knows more about Japanese literature than any Japanese. Then, if for some reason I have to write a kanji on a blackboard, it's as if somebody could know more Japanese, more about Japanese literature than Japanese, but doesn't read Japanese. This is a complete contradiction, which is rather irritating. But I still maintain my good humor. But I think that the important thing is to want to learn a foreign language and to spend a lot of time in it, reading books of various periods. Kyu Kanazukai is not difficult, but it's more logical than the modern Kanazukai because you don't know, for example, have a verb ending in, say, kao, and kawana. Why does it go from a to wa? It's because if you read it in the original, the Kyu Kanazukai is perfectly normal. Well, I can't really give you any easy way to learn a language. It really requires time and requires this very strong motivation. You must feel this is something you really want to do. It's not casual. It's not something you pick up as you go along, but something you devote yourself to. And eventually, you will have that language.
Yoshio Hota, freelance. I'd like to know if you read the current Japanese fiction writers, such as Ryu Murakami or Haruki Murakami, and others. But if you do, I'd like to hear your analysis and your thought on their work.
I'll make a confession. I have tended for some years, ever since completing my history of Japanese literature, to read only for the books I'm writing. So I've been writing recently, last year, about the poet Masao Kashiki. I've read he has a collection of 25 volumes of Masao Kashiki, some of it rather difficult to read. And I have little time for reading for pleasure. I do it occasionally on an airplane, say, when I can't study. I find the contemporary writers interesting, but I'm very seldom moved by them. I find them ingenious. They have learned the trade of being a novel. They know how to write novels. But I sometimes feel that there's not much emotion behind them, not much of that. And for this reason, I don't read these modern books as often as I should. Perhaps when I finish my next book, I'll retire. At the moment, I have no plans to retire. I'll be writing my last book pretty long. Any case, then if I retire, I will read, as other people do, read for pleasure, for enjoyment of the modern writer's outlook on the world.
Thanks very much indeed for coming to It's Muir to give the Financial Times. It's been very interesting to hear. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the initial appeal of Japanese culture and literature to you. You mentioned the beauty that you saw in The Tale of Genji. Can you tell us what of all the other literatures that you'd had exposure to kind of grabbed you about Japan? And I think the previous question might have given us a sense of how you'll answer the next part, but do you think that what made Japan special to you then is being lost? Is modern Japan no longer the Japan that you fell in love with to some extent?
This is a kind of fundamental question. People often make fun of visitors to Japan who are here for a few weeks and write a book, and they think, how could you write a book about Japan in a few weeks? But there's a good chance that they will see things that not even the Japanese see of themselves. They will see things that people who have been here all the time have accepted. They don't think it's unusual at all. But an outsider may find something striking in Japanese culture that the person who was born to the culture or studied it for a long time does not immediately see. In my own case, the Tale of Genji was the critical work in my appreciation of Japanese literature. I must say I repeat, that this was in the translation of Arthur Wehrle. At a certain point, I decided that I could read anything in Japanese. I could read modern novels. There's no reason I couldn't read the Tale of Genji in the original language. This was a mistake. I think of the hours I spent on one page trying to understand who was doing what to whom. I thought, how did Wehrle find it? Where was it? It was a mystery to me. But at the same time, I vaguely understood what might have attracted him in the first place. And then, as I grew more proficient in reading classical Japanese, I had many occasions to find beauty of a different kind in the writing. For example, the Tale of the Heike, which is a splendid work, which has a flaw in it, at least a flaw in it for non-Japanese readers, is that there are too many references to events in classical China, in order to make the action of some Japanese seem more important, they would say he's like somebody in old China, just the way somebody might in one of the European countries liken somebody to one of the Romans or one of the classical Greek, giving a background. But if you don't know the background, it interrupts the narration. But there are many works of Japanese literature which are compellingly beautiful, and I was not in a position to understand at first. The language was too difficult. Reading a no play, you can read certain things. The utterances of the waki are very easy to understand. But once the poetry starts, it becomes very, very difficult, I think even for most Japanese. But if you have the love of the language, which I had and still have, and that has not changed, it becomes also a temptation or allurement. I realized at one point that if Japanese were written in Roman letters from the beginning, and there were never any kanji or kana, I probably wouldn't have been terribly interested in Japanese. I had the experience when I was teaching in England. One year I had no students at all. I felt very depressed, and I thought, I'll teach them other languages. I decided to learn Russian. So I took Russian lessons. I had no trouble learning the grammar, but I couldn't learn any of the vocabulary. And I realized eventually what the trouble was. I kept expecting to find the kanji behind it. Just when you have a Japanese word of pronunciation, and eventually, as you grow more proficient, you find the kanji, and this is the way it really should be. I kept on thinking that I would find the kanji at the back of these Russian words, and they never appeared. So I decided I was hopeless, that I would never be able to learn any language except one which had kanji in it. I'm afraid that I've also been finished with Korean, which is given enough.